As 1942 began, work was now continuing apace on getting the ships back afloat and into dock. The first good news in this regard was West Virginia. Thanks to a combination of Tennessee's unintentional save and the crew's own efforts, she'd settled upright, and so divers estimated that if the various holes could be patched and pumping done in a sensible order from the top down, she should just rise back up to the surface on an even keel, which in turn meant that a lot of the initial work on removing her main battery could now be stopped. This in turn would save a lot of time and effort both in actually removing the guns now and later on in reinstalling the guns once the ship was ready for sea again. Instead, work could be redoubled on cleaning and preserving the guns in place and getting various smaller holes patched ready for the lift. In the process of this, they also managed to recover what was left of one of the torpedoes that had struck the ship, which gave some of the base's weapons officers something to study. Across the Channel, an incredibly encouraging event was witnessed by those hard at work on Battleship Row as the floating dry dock YFD-2, formerly home to what was left of the USS Shaw, bubbled its way back to the surface. Thanks to not taking any direct hits, but rather being subjected to shrapnel and shockwave damage from the Shaw's magazine explosion, the process of refloating had been, relatively speaking, simple. Pumping air back into it and then having divers and other crew watching to see whether air or water bubbled out from various places and then applying small patches as necessary in those locations. Not only was this the first major salvage success, it would soon mean increased dock space at Pearl Harbor, although due to water getting into spaces that it really hadn't been welcome in, it was necessary to moor a small ship of some sort next to it at all times for the next few weeks in order to provide clean water and steam power, and of course there would need to be some immediate further repairs that were necessary, mainly surrounding the denting and warping of various parts of the dock's plating that had resulted from the explosion of Shaw and the resulting fires. Now the first rush of work on the recoverable battleships had taken place, it was also possible to spare men and divers for a better look at the Utah. While she was going to be a much lesser priority for overall salvage, there was still a fair bit of valuable equipment that could be removed from her, and then relocated to other vessels. But she'd rolled over onto her superstructure, and it was thought that this might break at any moment, and the divers would therefore be at risk of the ship rolling further, or moving. Luckily, the seabed on that side of Ford Island was somewhat firmer than the near-quicksand conditions which California found herself in, so it wasn't so much of a concern that the ship would move, and it quickly became apparent that Utah had actually gone over with enough force to shear away her masts and almost all other major superstructure elements, which meant that she was about as stable as it was possible to be for an overturned wreck, as she was resting on the stronger elements of her structure that were unlikely to give way. Still, there was precious little point in sending divers down, under, and then back into the ship, apart from the risk of bent air hoses, and so instead work began on cutting open the underside of the ship in selected locations and sending the divers more directly into the former lower decks to start recovering the large amounts of ammunition still in the ship's magazines, whilst pumps lowered the overall water level inside the hull, which allowed salvage workers with respirator masks only to assist in the areas which could be drained, thus freeing up fully equipped divers for work elsewhere. Many of those trained men would find their way over to what is apparently actually the Nevada, not the Nevada, where the various patches ranging from the size of a small window, mostly used to cover up a splinter hole or two, all the way up to the massive curved piece of master carpentry that was going to cover the torpedo impact site, were now in the process of being brought out and fixed into place on the ship, then sealed, checked, and rechecked. Whilst this work was going on down below, several large pumps were being installed on the upper deck of the ship itself, even as a floating derrick carefully edged its way between the California and the refloated dry dock, with the centrepiece of the salvage work ready for lowering and fitting, this of course being the big patch. As said big patch was prepared for lowering and even more pumps were being installed, a small collection of barges began to assemble around the Nevada. Some were taking away debris as sections of the ship were cleared, others carrying boilers to provide the now ubiquitous steam and hot water cleaning jets to get rid of the oil. Still others for the recovery of personal property, amongst other things, where this could be salvaged. The details were numerous, down to the installation of long clotheslines back on land in order to dry out and salvage what was left of the crew's clothing, where this was salvageable at all. The big patch was lowered, but soon ran into problems. The lower section kept snagging on mud under the ship, and when this was dredged away, it revealed coral, which would also need to be cut through. As this went on, some of the pumps were activated and the de-watering of the ship began. Apart from anything else, it was thought this might raise Nevada somewhat, reducing the workload for the clearance crews who were trying to get enough room for the big patch to fit underneath the ship. After a couple of days, everything down to the second deck was free of water, although without the big patch in place there was a limit to how much further these efforts could go, but the cleanup of the upper portions of the ship could begin. The clean-up job would turn out to be possibly second only to body recovery duty in terms of being a job that nobody wanted to get assigned to. Imagine for a moment a thick soup of oil, paper, ink, clothing, raw meat, and other fresh provisions, and worse, that had all been left to collect together in semi-warm water, all enclosed in a large metal container that had then been subjected to heating by first fire, and then repeated warm Hawaiian days. Then left to ferment for over a month, and then, with most of the water drained away, and all the remaining solid and semi-liquid mass collecting together in pools and heaps across multiple decks, still in a relatively enclosed environment. About the only small mercy was that since the ship was still not on quite an even keel, once the larger items had been removed, like half carcasses of cows and sheep, the rest could be hosed down with hot water jets and the resulting sludge collected at the lower end of the ship, where a skimming unit could come in to collect and dispose of it. This would be followed by waves of men with cleaning rags and brushes, blowers circulating hot fresh air, and additional water-repelling and sealing chemicals which were used on the machinery. The big patch was, however, posing problem after problem. The coral wasn't budging easily, and it turned out that the lower edge of the patch was bumping into the portside docking keel. This was a wooden part of the ship's structure that was designed to support the ship when it was on blocks in a dry dock, and naturally it had been made of exceptionally tough wood, and so cutting through it underwater was proving to be extremely tedious. In the end, much like the dock key that had pinned Tennessee in place, the next logical step was clearly small charges of dynamite, which did at least get the job done somewhat faster. Some of the smaller holes were still leaking to varying degrees, and although patches were slowing this down, it was known that any leakage would increase dramatically once the ship started to move, and so it wasn't a case of completely sealing the ship, more just ensuring that the rate of water coming in would be less than the capacity of the pumps to chuck it back out again. By the end of the month, the clearance efforts had managed to reach some of the ship's own pumps, and these were cleaned, serviced, and fired back up, the battleship itself now lending aid to its own salvage effort. As the ship began to slowly flex under the increased buoyancy, the process was becoming a very delicate balancing act. Remove too little water and the ship's draft would not allow it to clear the dry dock. Remove too much, and with only or mostly air on the inside of the big wooden patch, the pressure of the water outside might crush the wooden framing in, and the ship would then sink again. By the start of February, the big patch was now in the last stages of adjustment before it was locked into position, and the full third deck was now clear of water. Anchors were run out to stabilise the ship when it got free, and to stop it drifting away. It wasn't getting any easier, though. Several men were killed by concentrated hydrogen sulfide gas, which was a product of the various organic materials aboard decomposing, which had then been concentrated under pressure in the water, and then been released when a new compartment was being inspected to see if it needed pumping out. As a result, further ventilation equipment was brought in, and the work continued. By the second week of the month, the stern had risen several feet, and the whole ship was now rising at the rate of about a foot per day. Friday the 13th of February might have been considered unlucky for some, but on that day in 1942 came the welcome official news that, with a flurry of displaced sediment, the sleeping giant that was the Nevada had roused itself and was afloat once more. But due to the slowing of the work to account for the hydrogen sulfide issue and the considerable amount of water left in compartments just inside of the big patch, it wasn't likely the ship would reach a draft that was sufficient to get it into Dry Dock 1. Luckily though, Dry Dock 2 could take deeper draft ships, and with that dock having recently cleared the torpedo-damaged carrier Saratoga for passage back to the continental United States, the Nevada preferred for relocation to the new dock. The magazines, recently cleared of water, were emptied, and on the 17th tow lines were attached, and the ship was towed out into the middle of the channel. With the Nevada now in deeper water, divers found the big patch had actually extended several feet deeper than expected, which would itself scupper the attempt to get her into any dry dock, even Dry Dock 2. Although removing it now would mean significantly increased pressure on all the closed internal bulkheads around the breach, it was decided to try and do so there and then, and hope that the bulkheads held on the last bit of the journey, since once the ship got going, it could then be run right into the dock instead of stopped at the entrance to enact the same procedure of taking the patch off there. As ultimately, if the bulkheads failed, the ship would likely capsize in a matter of minutes, and if that was going to happen, it was honestly better that it happened in the channel, where dredging and blasting efforts might be able to make some kind of path around her, rather than right outside one of Pearl Harbor's precious dry docks, where there really wasn't another route in. As the sun rose on the 18th, the pumps aboard Nevada were on up to full power, the tugs came alongside, and the ship began the run for the dry dock. It was considerably down by the bow due to the body of water that was still inside due to the torpedo hole, but with some of the aft tanks flooded to get the whole ship to rotate slightly so the very tip of the bow rose just a fraction, by 10 o'clock in the morning she was over the threshold of Dry Dock 2, the dock gates were closed, and water began to be pumped out. As the water level, and thus the pressure, decreased, the pumps could also start clearing out some of the water in the bow compartments, levelling out the ship so that it could be settled onto the dry dock blocks. With Admiral Nimitz watching, the first of the salvaged battleships came to a gentle rest as the water levels dropped lower, eventually being left high and dry with water cascading out of various breech compartments as the sun began to dip toward the western horizon. Winding the clock back to the start of January, we'll head on over to California, not the state, the battleship, somewhat shorter journey. 3 of her 4 turrets were able to be worked on, with everything that was being removed being carefully labelled so that it could all be put back together again once the ship was out of the current predicament. The plan for the salvage of the ship had changed somewhat. Instead of encircling the entire ship with one massive steel cofferdam, which events had shown would probably just be swallowed up by the mud anyway, it had been decided that a partial wooden version would enclose a portion of the ship, with smaller versions around each torpedo hit. Smaller holes than this would have wooden patches placed over them just in the water, and the larger ones, sheltered by the various cofferdams, would be filled in with concrete held in by a wooden formwork. The difference between this and the approach taken on Nevada was the need to clear the holes of mud first, and the fact that California was, for now at least, pretty much stuck in place and had more holes in her. Sealing the compartments around each hole and then pumping the rest of the ship out, as on Nevada, simply wouldn't get her free, and even if she was dug out, the ship's draft would prevent her from ever docking for repairs, so she had to be as sealed up as possible and then as completely drained as possible. The weight of the concrete would of course mean she was still running deep, but not deep enough to prevent her getting over the sill of the dry dock. That was the idea, anyway. There were delays in getting the guns out of the turrets, as these needed the attention, quite understandably, of the biggest of the floating cranes in the base's possession, and demand for the particular services of those cranes was a little bit high. Still, after several days of on and off lifting, all guns, except those of Turret 4, were away, and the first of the wooden patches for the ship arrived. This one was designed to cover the largest hole not being dealt with via cofferdam, this being a breach in the bow that had been caused by near miss from a bomb. Like the Nevada, California would need fresh water and steam generators, pressure washers, ventilation equipment and such, but since the sides of the ship would be littered by cofferdams, that would hinder the approach of barges, it was instead decided to install all of this on the upper deck, along with the first of numerous pumps. The massive timbers needed for these cofferdams were being prepared ashore, but the number of carpenters was limited, and the use of a similar approach on the West Virginia was dividing their attention, and so work began to slow, as the only things left to do really were to ensure that small water entry points were stopped up and the casemates were sealed. Thus, it wasn't until the same day as Nevada got afloat that the cofferdams began construction on the California. Whilst above water, the last of the cage mast material, along with the heavy conning tower, was in the process of being cut down or unbolted, respectively. Now, quite experienced thanks to their work on Nevada, the cofferdams started to be installed at a rapid pace. Within 10 days, most of the cofferdams were in place, and the divers prepared for the next task, sealing them. This couldn't be done ashore, as the inevitable slight movements in the wooden structures when they were fixed to the ship's side would inevitably cause minor deformations. So the only solution was to watch for leaks as the pumps cleared the interiors, and then have divers plug those leaks externally as the water levels continued to drop. Inside the ship, various covers, seals and doors were being closed, tightened or replaced as necessary, oil was being pumped out of various areas that it had collected in, and the conning tower began to be lifted off of its seating. With most of February gone, the pumps started up, and the divers started their sealing work, watching the flow of any stray drifts of oil in the water to work out where the water was being drawn to. Within a few days, the forecastle deck was dry, and work on the quarterdeck cofferdam, the largest, was well underway. Cleaning the forward part of the ship began as good news emerged from below. Like with Nevada, there was a good chance that due to the underwater repairs and replacement of various seals, doors and manhole covers within the ship, it might be possible to get the California refloated without having to completely seal up the torpedo holes with concrete. The balancing act of getting water out versus not having the bulkheads collapse would be similar, as with the California's older relative, but it would save time both now, in terms of not actually having to pour massive amounts of concrete, and later when it came to making repairs in the dry dock, because you wouldn't then have to break out massive amounts of concrete. This was all just as well, since manpower was becoming a major issue, with large salvage efforts ongoing on West Virginia, some limited recovery of materials happening on Arizona, and work going on to various destroyers and the minesweeping command ship Oglala. The demands for large numbers of men were increasing daily, and the cleaning and clearing work was incredibly manpower intensive and slowing down again. This wasn't helped by the fact that as time had gone on, various members of the California's crew, including some of her most experienced men, had been sent off to other roles in the fleet, which left them with fresh levies of sailors completely unfamiliar with the ship having to be trained by the shrinking pool of men who were familiar with it, which slowed work further still. And that was without the big issue hanging over the whole project. Both California and West Virginia were turbo-electric drive ships, and electrical equipment really does not like prolonged submergence in salt water, even before all the other pollutants involved in this particular incident got involved. It was an open question as to if at least some of the equipment would be salvageable once the ships got into dock. If not, then the entire trip back to the continental United States would have to be made entirely under tugs without any power aboard the ship itself, except for maybe the odd generator to provide a few lights. That would be an incredibly dangerous proposition. By early March, the last of the cofferdam sections were being secured, and sealing of them was ahead of schedule. The main conning tower was now ready to be taken off, and the second conning tower had likewise been broken free of its stand. By mid-March, the suction of the mud was beginning to be overcome, as between the pumps and the natural buoyancy of the cofferdam's wooden construction, the stern was beginning to rise out of the mud, bringing the vessel to a slightly more even fore-to-aft level, although the ship was still listing to port. Still, the cleaning of the bulk of the ship could begin, as it was pumped out level by level, taking in all the lessons from the Nevada, including the need for plenty of ventilation to prevent the build-up of hydrogen sulfide. By the 15th of March, the cleaning work was well underway as rivers of sludge either ran or were pumped out, whilst across the channel the happy sight of the Nevada emerging from Dry Dock 2 was seen. Now, the ship was watertight enough to be towed over to the general repair facilities, opening up the dock for another ship. Still, the cleaning work on California would take a lot longer. She was, after all, a larger ship, and more of her had been underwater. Captain Wallin sent out a lengthy message to encourage the works crews, setting them to a certain degree in competition with what he rather deliberately characterized as the industrious Japanese, and exhorting the men of the United States Navy to show that surely they were better at hard work than their enemies were. The work thus continued apace, but as they reached further down into the ship, it became a much grimmer task. Almost 50 of the ship's crew had never been found after the attack, and soon enough, on the second deck level, the repair crews began to find what was left of many of these unfortunate men. Pumping slowed at the third deck level to allow for recovery of the remains, which, grim as it sounds, were easier to float into bags than to recover in bits from a drained deck. This effort recovered about half of the missing crew and allowed the ship to break free of the mud completely just after March the 20th. By the 29th, only 16 men were left unaccounted for, and after a thorough search of the remaining third deck area, the pumps were ramped back up again. By the end of the month, the ship only showed a slight list to port, although with a draft of 43 feet, there was still some work to be done. Luckily, most of the oil had been taken out of the ship during the pause at the third deck level, so the engine room salvage efforts would only have to deal with massive saltwater contamination instead of all of that, plus oil sludge. By the 3rd of April, the ship was riding high enough to get into a dock. But now there was no space available. Lexington had arrived earlier in the day for refit in Dry Dock 2, and a cruiser plus 2 destroyers occupied Dry Dock 1. Work had progressed at almost warp speed on Dry Dock 3, but Dry Dock 3 had been designed to handle smaller ships and was too small to fit the battleship. Instead, they would have to wait for a few days until after the 8th, when Lexington was due to head over to the fitting out and repair basin. Whilst they were waiting, the anchor chain that had been used months previously to try and keep the ship closer to the quay was unwrapped from around the barbette of Turret 1, and various plates used to seal the upper areas of the ship, such as the casemates, were removed to reduce overall weight, since now those areas were reasonably above the waterline again. Clearing of the magazines, cleaning of the engine rooms, and the short straw job of emptying the meat locker were also undertaken, with a random large explosion, probably caused by a pocket of uncovered aviation gasoline that had fumigated, adding to a bit of excitement to the proceedings. Although 5 men were injured, luckily nobody was killed. More seriously, the explosion blew off a patch that sent water back into numerous cleared compartments, and that in turn sent the bow plunging 5 feet further down. Luckily, all the pumps and crew were called on, and the area was isolated, repatched, and pumped out again over the next few days, with one of the conning towers lifted off the ship to assist with the weight issue. And so it was that on the 9th of April, the California became the second battleship to be successfully salvaged from the depths, entering Dry Dock 2 at around 11 o'clock in the morning, joined in the dock by the small tug Sotoyomo, which had been recovered from next to the floating dry dock YFD-2. The water level was dropped, and repair work could begin in earnest, with some of her big electrical components being lifted out for further repair work back home, their transport back to the continental United States being the Nevada, which was almost ready to head for Puget Sound, with a sailing date set of the 22nd of April. So, of the battleships that had been damaged or sunk during the attack, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Nevada, and California were now afloat and in some stage of repair, refit, or shakedown cruise. That left 4, and once you accounted for the fact that Arizona was already being considered a write-off, and Utah, being a training ship, was not as vital for the war effort as compared to the theoretically combat-capable vessels, you're actually just down to Oklahoma and West Virginia. So, once more, let's wind the clock back to the beginning of January and travel a few hundred yards further up the channel still, to the West Virginia herself. The shortages of skilled workers that had affected Nevada and California also affected West Virginia, but unlike those ships, since the guns and most of the other superstructure were not going to be removed, except where already damaged, some of that workforce in question wasn't actually needed, which did serve to alleviate the pressure on the other two big ships. But the one thing the ship did need was carpenters. A patching system was also called for here, but whereas the other two ships had holes, which were in some cases quite large, but were at least distinct punctures, on West Virginia, the damage that was closest to something that you could coherently patch was an area below the forward superfiring turret. But amidships, in an area roughly delineated as the space between the two masts, there was basically just a twisted mess of material and plating that had once ostensibly been the ship's hull, but now looked more like an angry velociraptor deity with C4 equipped claws had taken a swipe at the ship. The only way to solve this was to get a monster patch in, and to get that to even fit required sending in divers to cut away all the various outturned bits of metal where they could, and elsewhere just simply detach entire hull panels that were too far gone. However, before they could start, there was some work to do above the waterline, where twisted and fire-weakened elements of the superstructure and the upper deck threatened to break free and fall on the divers, or their supporting units, at pretty much any time, not to mention potentially snagging air hoses and the like, and so work had to be begun on cutting away the worst of this. The resulting wreckage and other debris were then taken ashore and sorted into a myriad different categories. Some of it would just be thrown away, other items would be melted down for their metal, items that could be repaired and reconditioned for equipping the ship later on went into storage, and certain items in very high demand on active duty warships like rangefinders and telescopes were sent off to a stockpile of ready-use items waiting for a ship to come back from the deep Pacific with a need for a new piece of equipment. Preparations were made for the now, unfortunately, familiar task of clearing out a waterlogged ship and, of course, the grim task of recovering bodies. More crew were unaccounted for on West Virginia than had been the case on California or Nevada, and the divers had, for the first few weeks, reported faint tapping sounds coming from within the hull. But by mid-January, these noises had gradually faded away to a grim silence. Adding to the list of things to do was a diving report from the stern at the end of the month. The rudder had vanished, which seemed very careless, and in its place there was another heretofore unreported torpedo hole, which would need further trimming and patching. A search around the stern eventually located the two pieces of the rudder it had been blown in two, as well as the aft end of the torpedo that had been responsible. This latter part was hauled out, and this now doubled the US Navy's cache of Japanese torpedo parts. By the end of January, the first supporting elements of the patches had arrived, and frames began to be attached to the ship. Whilst above the current waterline, work was done to further shore up the deck so that it would support A-frame cranes, pumps, and the various other equipment that would be due to be installed. And as the masts were going to be replaced anyway, and they contributed greatly to top weight, work was also started in taking down the mainmast. By the time Nevada passed by on its way into dock, the first of the patch faces were going the other way to West Virginia. Unlike the patches designed for the other two ships, the ones for West Virginia would have to replace large sections of the ship's outer shell, and thus were a composite of concrete, steel, and wood. Also, because of the sheer area involved, there would not be any single large units, but rather multiple smaller, relatively speaking at least, and easier to handle sections that would then be joined together once they were in place. So extensive was the hull damage that, for a good portion of the amidship section, about the only part of the ship that was somewhat where it was supposed to be was the belt armour. and even this was somewhat bent out of shape. Everything above and below it was either just gone, or else had been punched so deep into the ship that it was practically useless. And so the belt itself became part of the patch system, since 13-inch thick slabs of steel turned out to be rather excellent solid mounting points for the lower or upper edges of the patches as applicable. There was also the delicate task of partially entering the ship through the various rents in the hull to find where intact frames might be in order to mount shoring beams, so that the water pressure didn't simply cave in the patches as water was pumped out and the external pressure relative to the internal pressure increased. Fresh from success cleaning mud out from underneath the Nevada, divers began clearing mud off of the coral that was supporting the West Virginia's weight to allow the lowest tier of patches to be fixed on parts of the hull that still remained. By the end of February, most of the individual patches were in place, with the exception of the long one on the upper section of West Virginia's side, and the job of adjusting the fit and sealing the gaps between the individual sections with concrete that were in place could begin. Soon the steam boilers, pumps and other equipment began to arrive, and places on the open area of the ship were sought for them. Portholes were either shut or plated over where this wasn't possible, and with a rattle and then a thrum, the highest of the ship's galleys, cleaned out and prepared, came back to life, allowing the works crews to get their meals aboard the ship without a long and complicated filtering off of the ship to Ford Island, and then back again. As air compressors and pumps arrived aboard and the mainmast was lifted off, the retention of more of the ship's upper works meant a premium on space for the equipment, and it was decided to turn the aftmost turret to free up centerline deck space. But, as it turned out, shells in the handling room had rolled into the gears during the sinking. The next job was thus, instead, to dive down and close the various hatches into the barbette so that it could be pumped out. The shells could then be extracted, and the turret would then be free to rotate. Preparations continued, but further work on pumping out the ship paused whilst the main effort was made to get California up and away. Instead, the rest of the ship's hatches were opened to drain all internal water to the lowest levels, where powerful pumps could more easily extract it. This was remarkably different to Nevada and California, where as many of these hatches and manhole covers had been closed as was humanly possible, but it reflected a slightly different way of salvaging. By mid-April, the remaining sections of patching were being placed and ammunition was being removed from the various turrets. Pumping began in earnest, and with the lessons learned from the aft turret, the forward turret was also rotated to make way for another large pump. At this stage, with the final patching sections not quite yet watertight, the aim of the pumps wasn't to actually unwater the ship, but to get the worst of the hydrogen sulfide saturated water out of the ship, in order to make the eventual draining much safer, as, relatively speaking, fresh water would come in through the various bits that hadn't been sealed yet. By the start of May, the last patch sections were in place and the pumps were switched to pumping out the water properly, and concrete seam sealant was poured in to ensure the patches were as close to watertight as possible. Now, for a third time, the grim task of cleaning the interior of the ship, and inevitably recovering bodies, could begin as the water levels dropped. By mid-May, the second deck was clear, and the usual mixture of rotten material and salvaged personal items began to make their way off the ship. Of course, after 2 additional months in the water, the 49 bodies found initially as the crew probed deeper were in an even worse state than those on California, and once again pumping was paused to allow the remains to be recovered, which left 21 men unaccounted for. As the job was completed and the pumps racked up again to full power, West Virginia rose slowly from the depths on the 17th of May 1942, rolling and pitching somewhat unevenly as water rolled around in the now free-floating ship, and more compartments were emptied, which changed the overall balance of the ship on an hour-by-hour basis. By the 24th, she was mostly level and anchored in place to stop her drifting. Additional bits of torpedo and at least one of the heavy bombs converted from a 16-inch shell, its fuse having failed, were dug out of the ship as efforts got deeper and deeper into it. But, even afloat, her draft was currently still too deep for Dry Dock 1, and by this point Dry Dock 2 was occupied by California. This was further complicated by the Battle of the Coral Sea. Lexington was lost and Yorktown was limping back, but would need first priority on any dry dock space, as Nimitz wanted her turned around in time to go back out with Enterprise and Hornet for what was going to prove to be the Battle of Midway. Whilst Midway was being fought, further ammunition was unloaded to try and lighten the ship to hit a 32-foot draft, which would allow it to enter Dry Dock 1. Additional bodies were being found as the deeper parts of the ship were being cleared. Eventually, a total of 67 would be recovered, which left only 3 unaccounted for once all had been said and done. But this included some real tragedies. Men were found high in the engine rooms, and in one case in a locked storeroom, where air bubbles and working bulkhead doors had kept a number of them alive. According to the calendars they'd kept, they'd been sitting in the dark for well over 2 weeks, which was well after the divers had made their first passes on the hull, hammering on the outside looking for signs of life. But the crew inside had not been heard, and gradually their air had run out. By the start of June, however, with the removal of oil from the fuel tanks, as well as 70 tons of rotten meat, milk and cheese from the refrigerated stores area, as well as secondary ammunition, the reduction in ship's draft had continued still further, and on the 7th of June, the dry dock was made ready, whilst Dry Dock 2 released California to the repair basin. With battles with the Japanese Navy becoming more frequent, the US Navy wanted the deeper Dry Dock 2 free for any critically damaged returning ships, especially carriers, and so, just after lunchtime on the 9th, tugs guided the West Virginia over the threshold to settle on the blocks ready for an extensive hull repair, which she would need if she was ever going to sail again in Dry Dock 1. Now, every battleship that could be realistically salvaged was in the yard's hands. There was still other work to do. Oglala, Utah, Oklahoma, and the various destroyers had all had work done in the interim, but when we return in a few weeks' time to the third and final part of the series, we'll take a look at the work that was done to some of these vessels.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.